Welcome to episode 34 of the Tax Professionals podcast. This episode is all about how to delegate tax work, particularly to people who are less experienced or junior.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
I remember when I first became someone's manager, which is about 2 years ago now, and we hired the person who I was managing because we needed more capacity in the team. We had a lot of work on and not enough people to deliver it. And because of this, when we took this person on board, I knew that I needed to be able to delegate to them. But up until this point, I had minimal experience in delegating, like only a few small pieces to a few people here and there, nothing major. And I knew this was going to be different. And I almost thought it was going to be as simple as asking a person to do a task. They would go away and do it. It would all come back perfectly and everyone would be happy, which is a slightly naive approach considering that I've seen so many people struggle with delegating in the workplace. I started to understand the barriers that people have to delegating and why people find it difficult, but I was determined to find a way to do it well and to set the person up who's doing the work up for success as much as possible. I had a guest on the podcast previously who talked about delegation, so I took on board his points. I've been asking for advice and feedback from more senior colleagues to just get their tips and advice on how to delegate better, and I've tried a bunch of different approaches, and over time I could tell that I was getting better at it and that the results from work delegated were coming back better. But it wasn't probably until about a month or two ago where I really had like a eureka moment, which is what I really want to share with you today towards the end of this episode. But I also want to share what I've learned so far to help you to become better at delegating, particularly to more junior or less experienced staff, because they won't have the tax knowledge at that point, which is a difficulty when you're delegating tax work in particular. So the episode will cover barriers and misconceptions around delegation, which starts around 4 minutes 20 into the episode. It also covers benefits of delegation and also reasons to delegate, which is from about 11 minutes 40 into the episode. I talk about my eureka moment and how you can use this to help you delegate better from around 16 minutes into the episode. And part of my eureka moment is using this delegation form that I created. I talk about it in that section of the episode, but you can also download a copy of the delegation form, which is designed to help you to have more success and delegate better. And you can download that at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/delegation form. If you enjoy this episode and want to learn more about delegation, you can take a listen to episode 4 of the podcast, which is How to Be a Better Delegator with Mike Clayton, who is pretty much an expert in delegation. And you can access this episode by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP34, or you can just type in the Tax Professionals podcast to most podcast apps and all the episodes will come up there. Make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes of the podcast that will help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career by subscribing or signing up to email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. The email notifications will give you a brief summary of each episode so that you can decide whether or not you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. Without further ado, let's get to it. Let's first talk about the barriers to delegating and also some misconceptions. So you've probably already heard some of these barriers already, and I think they're completely typical and also understandable as to why these barriers exist. So a lot of people will think that it's quicker to do the work themselves than it is to delegate it. They might think that they would do a better job themselves than if they were to delegate it to someone else. Maybe there's a lack of trust there, so you don't trust that the other person is going to do exactly what you need them to do and they're not going to put in as much effort or try as hard as you would to do a good job. And you also might hear that people just find delegating difficult. And delegating is difficult, and what doesn't help is that we aren't really taught how to delegate. So we have to kind of try and figure it out for ourselves a little bit. It's much harder when it comes to delegating tax work as well, because we have to be correct, we have to be accurate, we have to provide advice. We can't afford to be incorrect, so we can't afford for the work to not be up to scratch. So that makes it even more difficult than, say, delegating some other tasks. And would you believe actually that from a book that I read recently, 70% of managers find it difficult to delegate work. 70%. So if you're one person that's in that category, don't feel like you're alone. I think some of the barriers are slightly short-sighted, I would say, particularly the ones about doing it quicker yourself or doing it better yourself. So just before I jump into this story, it's probably worth mentioning that the first person that we hired when I first started in managing someone, they left after about 2 months, and we rehired someone pretty quickly after that. So really, when I'm referring to the person who I first managed, I'm not referring to that person who we had in the 2-month period. I'm referring to the person who replaced them, because I don't really count that 2-month period, to be honest, but I will mention that a little bit more later when I talk about feedback after a piece of work that's been delegated has been complete. So when we had this new person, the person I was managing, I had this one task that I was doing regularly that was taking up quite a lot of my time, but was a fairly straightforward task. So we do some regular compliance checks from an employment tax perspective on quite a few of our clients. And when I first started, when I first delegated that piece of work, it definitely didn't save me any time at all. In fact, it probably cost me more time, because there was a massive training exercise that was involved in delegating that piece of work. Probably about 2 to 3 weeks in, it got to a point where I was probably spending the same amount of time, or maybe a little bit less than I would have done if I was doing the work completely myself. But fast forward to now, I'm not really involved in that piece of work at all. I have minimal involvement in it. It's pretty much entirely done by this one person in the team and another person in the team who we've hired since. And all I do now really is review the work, make a few tweaks, and then finalise it. And so now I have so little time that I invest into that piece of work, and it has had a massive payoff to me. So yes, it might be quicker to do something yourself in the first instance, but over time you will save yourself a lot of time if you spend that time training someone, if you spend that time helping someone to get better, etc. So I would say that's definitely a key point to take away. And then just very quickly touching upon the point of I would do it better myself. So the people who now do this piece of work for me, they don't necessarily do it in the same way that I would have done it. Is it better? Is it worse? I would say it's probably just different. So when delegating, you do need to kind of just acknowledge that it might not be the way that you do it, but does that mean it's not good? Which is exceptionally hard to get over, because I'm a perfectionist and I tend to think that the way that I do things is the best. But you've really got to get over that if you want to be able to delegate properly. Just the last few points I want to mention, which are basically some misconceptions, is that a lot of people, I think, when they think of delegation, they think that it's about just abdicating responsibility completely and passing it over to someone else. And that is not the case with delegation. When you're delegating, you need to support your staff, you need to train your staff, and you need to be the one that's ultimately retaining that responsibility, but giving the person who you're delegating to the tools to do a good job. Another thing is, I think it's very easy to think that it is the delegatee that is the problem and not you. And I've definitely felt like this in the past, wrongly and completely arrogantly. I accept and appreciate that now. And I've got an example actually from just a week ago where we've been doing a SAO review for a client in relation to employment taxes. I wanted this person's support on the expenses part of the SAO review. So one of the things I said that I expected was that they fully understood the travel expenses rules that were going to be in play for this piece of work. So what I said was spend about an hour or so going through your ATT memory jogger around the travel expenses and make sure that you understand them, and also take a look at the previous SAO work we did around expenses. And now this is where I made a communication mistake, because I said do not spend any more than an hour doing those things. Going through the memory joggers, going to look at the scope of work, going to look at the previous work that we did. So in my head, the reason I said that was because I didn't want them to spend too long on this, but I wanted them to get kind of in the right frame of mind before they started doing the work. I didn't want to restrict at all the amount of time that they took needing to understand the rules and doing research, like through HMRC guidance, legislation, whatever else it is, because I wanted them to use this as a training exercise to fully understand those rules so that they could advise and help on projects in relation to that in the future going forward. But what they took away from the conversation was that they should spend no more than an hour researching and trying to understand the rules, etc. So they limited themselves to an hour and spent no more on that. So in hindsight, I can understand why they thought that. I can understand why they took that away from the conversation. So that was a mistake I made. I should have been more clear about that. And I accept full responsibility for that. One thing that they could have done though, and they accept this and they appreciate this too, is they could have raised it with me that they thought that having an hour to do all those things that I just said just wasn't enough time, because they felt like that from the start. And if they would have mentioned that, that would have given an opportunity for us to iron out that miscommunication, but equally I could have been more clear up front. So it was a learning curve for both of us, but the point I'm trying to make here is you as the delegator could be the problem. So just accept that that is the case, be humble, be willing to take feedback and be willing to learn from it. So let's now move on to the reasons to delegate and the benefits of delegation. And I'm just going to start this section with a little story about an ex-colleague. So this person was exceptionally good at their job. They provided great advice, clients loved them, they won loads of work, you name it, they could do it. And they kind of got to a point where they became exceptionally busy, like to the extent that they were working very late at night up until like 10 o'clock. They were working weekends and they basically had no time to themselves. They were pretty much working all the time. We used to often go out for lunch together to a place actually called Love Chicken, which is basically a KFC knockoff, but very nice food, and we used to go there quite regularly. And we went there one day. I kind of asked him, like, why do you not delegate some of this work over to other people within the team? And he just said to me that they're not ready, I haven't got the time to train them, and he was listing loads and loads of excuses as to, or reasons as to why he wasn't delegating this work. But then there came a problem because he was working so much, so late, pretty much every day of the week. He burnt out, and you could just see it over like a period of time. He was becoming more and more burnout, and he left a few months after that. And whilst he's never said this to me, I think that the reason that he decided to leave was because he became so burnt out and he got himself into such trouble by holding all the work himself and trying to complete it himself that he just couldn't cope anymore. So this is a key reason why you should delegate, really, because you don't want to get to that point of burnout. You don't want to be working ridiculous hours. It just isn't the right thing to do. So that is a main benefit of delegation. Some other benefits of delegation as well are that it kind of allows staff to feel valued, and that can motivate them. So if you're giving them responsibility for a task and they are like, great, I've got this, I want to do a really good job of it, etc. You've given them responsibility, it can make them feel valued, it can make them feel motivated. Another one is delegation allows you to train staff and give them the opportunity to develop. So I remember this one time in my first tax job when I was doing a bunch of case law research in relation to a HMRC case where they wanted to basically extract data directly from a client's computer. And our position was that they weren't allowed to do that under their information gathering powers. But the HMRC officer kept pushing and was insistent that they could do that. So I got given the task of doing case law research and going to look at the legislation and then also cases around it to see whether or not we could back up and substantiate our case with case law to HMRC. I felt so motivated to help this client because it felt like HMRC were just acting exceptionally unreasonably. I also felt motivated because I felt like I got given an important task. I learned so much from this because it was the first time I'd really got involved in case law, so I went through the motions of figuring out how to use it, how to find relevant case law, and then how to interpret that and take away the useful points from it. writing summaries on case law. There were so many things that I learned from this task being delegated to me. It was unbelievable. Then what was even better as well at the end is, after I'd done all that research, after I'd summarised it, and after my colleague had used that to go back to HMRC and justify that what they were trying to do, they didn't have the power to do that, we were successful. We got them to back down and they took a different approach. So it just felt like such a good experience. It felt like I was put in the deep end. It probably was a little bit past what I could be expected to do well at that point in my career, but I took the bull by the horns and I did it, and I learned so much from it. So you can do the exact same with your staff. You can give them that authority, you can give them that responsibility and give them a task, and even if they don't do a good job of it, so what? They've had a go, they've probably learned something from it, and if you never give them the opportunity to learn, then they won't. So they need that opportunity, and delegation is a great way to do that. Once you've then trained and developed your staff anyway, then you've got a good, strong team around you, which is just going to set you up for more success in the future. So I'm now going to move on to kind of my fairly recent eureka moment when it's come to delegation, and I suppose explain to you how you can do the same and hopefully get the same results as I have from it. But I'll tell you first off how kind of we've led up to the eureka moment. So the person I referred to earlier, the first person that I managed and still do manage, so they were doing these ongoing checks, these regular checks that I referred to earlier, and they got good at this. They were doing a good job of it, and I kind of felt that they were ready for the next step and doing a piece of related work, but which was more difficult because it required more knowledge and it required more skills than doing the regular checks needed. And I became pretty frustrated very quickly when it came to delegating this piece of work. So we'd done it like 3 or 4 times. I felt like I was giving lots of feedback to try and help them get better, but it didn't seem to be moving in a positive direction at all. It seemed quite stale, and it was incredibly hard for me because, to be honest, I just didn't know what to do. I felt like I tried lots of things, so I asked for advice from the partner in the team, from other colleagues. I went back to the previous episode that I recorded with Mike Clayton on delegation. I researched stuff online, and I just couldn't seem to get to a point where we were moving in the right direction. So in the end, what I decided to do, and this is what led on to the eureka moment, is I created what I call a delegation form, which I now use when I'm delegating pieces of work. Kind of the point of it is, why I've created it is to help get what's in my head out of it and into the other person's head who I've asked to do the work, so they have kind of the best chance possible to do a good job of the piece of work. So the form goes through the background for the piece of work. It goes through the outcomes, what am I expecting them to provide to me as an outcome? What are the deadlines on those outcomes? What are the expectations around this piece of work? What authority do they have? Are they able to go and contact clients directly? Do they need to have their emails or work reviewed before it goes out? What administration do they need to do, such as filing emails or sending off forms to HMRC? And resources, which is giving them kind of a steer and help towards some use of resources that they could use when completing this piece of work. When I first used this form in relation to this piece of work for the person that I manage, the difference was just unbelievable. Like the quality and the improvement in the work that they did was so much better than what it was before. Like so much, I literally couldn't believe it. Now don't get me wrong, there were still areas for improvement after the first time I used this, but it was just so much better, which was great, particularly because I felt like I was struggling and I wasn't really getting anywhere for some time. In this instance anyway, at least, what I think is the most important part of this delegation form and explaining what needs to be done, etc., is the expectations part of it. So I think that's kind of always been the miscommunication, if you want to call it that, between me and the person that I was delegating this work to. So when I was using this form on this piece of work, one of the areas where I realised there was an expectation miscommunication was that this person had a lot of work on to do, and they were trying to do lots of pieces of work, saying within a decent, not long amount of time. So they were trying to do more of a lower quality than less of a higher quality. And what I would have wanted them to do was to do less pieces of work to a good quality, because that means that there's a lot less time needed from me and other managers reviewing work within the team to finalise and complete it. It means that they're having the best opportunity to also progress and develop and become better at doing the work. And the problem is when you get a piece of work that has been done quickly just to get more out, is you might as well have not even delegated the piece of work in the first place. You probably save so little time and there's so little benefit taken out of that for me at least, it's not worth it. And so once I made that clear to this person and I started putting in the delegation sheet that, look, I expect you to take as much time as you need to do a good job of this. If you've got other work on that you feel like is clashing with the deadline here, let me know and we'll see whether we can move it around, whether I can help, whether someone else in the team can take off you, whatever it is. That one has made a massive difference. I would say that you're never going to get the expectations right first time, and it's always going to change. It's going to be different depending on the person, their skill level, etc. But if you can spend enough time thinking about what you expect so that the person who's doing the work knows what is expected of them, then I feel like you're giving them the best chance possible to do what you need them to do, what you want them to do. So there's no need to remember all those points that I've gone through in terms of what's included on this delegation form, because I've actually created a template delegation form for you to download and for you to use when delegating work. So you can get a copy of that by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/delegation form. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/delegation form. So one thing I would say just before moving off this section is, as well as using the form to put something in writing, is I would use the form to first off go through the piece of work with the person verbally, so talk them through each of those sections first, then follow it up in writing, and then give the person who's doing the work the opportunity to come back and ask questions and clear things up, etc. In relation to the form, and that will give them the best opportunity possible, I think at least, to do a good job of the tax work that's been delegated to them. One last point actually that I'll also add in relation to the expectations part of the delegation of the form is your expectations need to be reasonable for the person that you're delegating the piece of work to. So for example, you can't expect someone who's literally just started working in tax, the first tax job, to go and write a lovely letter that is perfect, that is technically correct, that reads well, that is commercial. You can't expect that of someone who's at that junior grade. So that's just something to bear in mind, and it's probably something that's quite difficult to do in reality, is to get those expectations exactly right. But if you have that discussion with the person you're delegating to, if you give them the opportunity to challenge any expectations, then you're more likely to get to a point where you come up with expectations that are reasonable. As mentioned earlier, one of the great things about delegation is that it gives the person you're delegating to the opportunity to progress, to develop, to train. I would say crucial in doing all of these things is giving feedback and having a debrief after someone's done a piece of work for you. So first off, I think that they should reflect on the work that they've done against kind of the outcomes, the expectations, etc. that you laid out to them up front. Let them have a think about that, to think how they did. Equally, if you're looking to get better at delegation, then why don't you have a reflect as well to think about whether you could have delegated better. Once the person's had time to reflect, you can then give them your feedback and points as to how they can improve. And equally, if you're looking to get better at delegating, ask them for some feedback. Is there anything that they think that you could have done better that would have given them a better chance and enabled them to do a better job of the work? I mentioned earlier that we had one person who lasted for about 2 months and then decided to leave the job. I just want to very quickly come back to that. And in the periods that they were doing these ongoing checks from a compliance perspective, I was absolutely bombarding them with feedback. And from my perspective, I thought that this was constructive feedback because I didn't feel like I was being negative. At least that wasn't the intention. The intention was to help them to get better and to improve. But I was giving them a lot of feedback, and it was probably quite overwhelming. One thing I learned from this is that really, as well as pointing out the constructive points, I also needed to start pointing out the positive points too, because if you don't get any of the positives, then it almost feels, I suppose, as if the person is moaning at you, that they're being quite negative. And I can see how I could have come across in that way, even though it was completely unintentional to do that. And I actually do think that the way that I was giving feedback here contributed a bit to them deciding to leave. They never said that direct to me. They said that the job wasn't really for them. But I can't help but have this feeling in the back of my mind that the way that I was giving feedback in that situation didn't help at all. So what I learned from that is one is to not bombard with constructive feedback, and pick out maybe the most important points rather than trying to pick up on every single point, and also point out the good things that they do too, the positives. So the delegation form that you can actually download does have a section which allows the person to put in their comments from the self-reflection, and then also a section for you to give your feedback as well. Whilst it is there to be done on the form, I would also have a conversation, whether that's up front or afterwards, but I would include the conversation there because that's going to give the person you're giving feedback to the opportunity to ask questions and make sure that they fully understand. And provided that you give an environment and create an environment that allows them to do that, then I think they will. And that will give them a lot of benefit too from doing the piece of work and making sure that they improve too. So I just got a few final points and final thoughts that when I was planning for this episode that I thought were good points to have, but I haven't really been able to fit them within any other section of this. Didn't seem to fit right there. So I just want to quickly run through those now. So I did mention this one briefly earlier, but I think it's absolutely critical that you give your staff enough time to do a thorough and a good job of a piece of work that you're delegated to them. If they've got loads of work on and they're feeling time pressured and they're feeling like they've got to do something quickly, then it is going to be rushed. It is going to feel like they haven't taken the time to do a good job, and it probably is just going to frustrate you. And so if they don't have enough time to do a proper job of it, help them to have enough time, take some work off them, or don't delegate it to them, because if you do, when they don't have enough time, you're basically setting them up to fail, which is not a good start for when you're delegating a piece of work. Another point is to be as supportive and as approachable as possible. So when you delegated out that piece of work, if they need help, if they've got questions, etc., then you would want them to be able to come to you and ask you those questions, because if they don't, then the chances are that the work isn't going to be as good if you spent that time to give the support and to be approachable. I would say my experiences that I've talked about in this episode are more to do with pieces of tax work that are more advisory and consultancy based than compliance based. Now, this could be an unreasonable statement, but at least in my experience, pieces of work that are very repetitive and are more towards compliance are much easier to delegate and train someone on than doing advisory work, because, it's very similar to do the same thing each time. Whereas when you're advising, when you're consulting, you don't really have the luxury to do that. So just bear that in mind when you're delegating pieces of work. If possible, giving compliance work and things that are repetitive to junior members of staff is a really good way to help them to get the knowledge and to get better, and it's going to give them a better chance of doing a good job of it as opposed to advisory work. And when you're giving them advisory work, or you want them to support an advisory work, try and give them parts that they're going to be able to do well. So could they go and just research a particular point? Could they draft a particular part of a letter? Whatever it is, can you give them a small part of it to help them to build up and to get better at it? That's usually helpful. I think when it comes to delegating and doing tax work as well, it's really important that the person that's doing the work understands the underlying tax rules. Now, if you're delegating to someone that's junior and new and less experienced, then they aren't going to have a thorough, in-depth understanding of all the tax rules. But give them the time to go and research it, give them the time to go and learn about them, talk about it, point them in the right direction, whatever it is. But if they don't understand the tax rules properly, then I just don't think they're going to have a good opportunity to do the piece of work well. So remember, there are lots of barriers to delegation, whether that's you feel like you could do the work quicker yourself, whether you could do it better yourself, whether you find it difficult. Work at it and become better at delegating. They're only barriers and you can get past them. And remember that delegation is actually positive and beneficial. Remember the guy that burnt out by not delegating. So really, I think it's an absolute key skill to learn if you don't want to be too busy and you want to be able to progress and improve your career. When delegating a piece of work, you need to be able to give them all the information to set them up for success when they're doing that piece of work. And the way that I feel you can do that is by following the delegation form that I talked about earlier. You can download a copy of this from heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/delegation form. And actually, I'd love to hear your experiences of using this form, if you feel like it's helped, if you feel like it's made a big difference, because it has done for me, so I would love to hear if it's done the same for you too. Equally, if it's not working for you, then feel free to get in touch with your thoughts. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to learn more about delegation, then you can take a listen to episode 4 of the podcast, which is How to Be a Better Delegator with Mike Clayton, who's an expert in delegation. And you can access this at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP4 or via most podcast apps if you just type in the Tax Professionals Podcast and head on over to episode 4. Don't forget to download the delegation form and use this when you delegate your next piece of work. It made such a big improvement for me, and hopefully it will do the same for you too. And you can get a copy of this from thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/delegation form. Link to the form and also to the episodes that I've just mentioned will be in the show notes for this episode, which can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP34, and that just stands for the Tax Professionals Podcast episode 34. You can subscribe or sign up for email notifications of the podcast to make sure that you don't miss out on any future episodes that will help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe, and the emails will give you a brief summary of the episodes, and episodes are released bi-weekly on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.